Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream on History 5 podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Jennifer Bird and Dr. Joseph A.P. Wilson. Thank you both for joining me today.
Thanks.
Thank you for having me.
Right.
Of course. So I'd like to start off with, well, obviously the topic we're going to be talking about today was the historical Paul the Apostle, sexist towards women. And so, was he sexist? Did he have a problem with women, or was he pro-women? What do we know about that?
All right, how are we going to do this, Joe?
I gather that we could do it like a debate, because I think that you're more firmly on the yes side and I'm on the more ambiguous side, like probably not. But the thing is, let me say, everybody here, just to your audience, that I proposed this dialogue between me and Dr. Bird a year ago when we were on your channel within a few days of each other talking about the same topic. And I heard your Q&A between each other and thinking, gosh, I wish I could like raise my hand in the back of the room and pipe in. And I don't want, there's no definitive answer here that we will come away with a solution that everyone agrees on. But I love it when tension and disagreement can result in people learning and growing this discussion. So I'd like to talk with you both about some of the issues and why it's ambiguous. And particularly my interest is not necessarily in pinning down the historical Paul, which is really hard because the real Paul is ambiguous. The real Paul is quite easy to read multiple different ways, right? Whereas the forgeries, which constitute half of his epistles, pretty much, like half of the stuff that is ascribed to him, was written by people later trying to get him to say what they wanted him to say. And that Paul is much less ambiguous. Like the Paul in 1 Timothy is very clear on these issues, right? He is absolutely, so pseudo-Paul can be quite easy to call a misogynist. And so the fact that there were misogynist forgers and editors who felt they needed to clarify his position,
or change it.
Change it. Well, clarify what they saw is the right reading, right? They were reading these same texts, these real Pauline texts, where there was different people reading it different ways. And by writing a new version or a supplement to the corpus, they could, eliminate the controversy. But obviously people have been arguing about this since the first century. The Corinthian correspondence itself is because this controversy existed in the earliest Pauline congregations, and it hasn't been resolved to this day.
Yeah, and what I would like to offer up front is just this kind of a idea that I think that there's an important nugget that made it into Galatians, right? That whole thing about no Jew or Gentile, which is a very important topic in and of itself, the no slave or free, and how he's talking about within the communities, that I'm going to put air quotes this way because we're not limited, right? The churches in that space, supposedly enslaved people are supposed to have a voice, which is really difficult to imagine in household spaces that they'd actually be able to be treated that way. But we know from history and some evidence that they actually were. And then also the no male or female. So there's an important early element to Paul's writings that is like some form of egalitarian. And what I think many people have not considered is Antoinette Clark Wire's book, because she's not just talking about, and she has really important content on this particular passage of 1 Corinthians 14, 34 and 35, but her whole book itself is looking at the letter as a whole and the rhetorical moves that Paul is making, or the person writing in Paul's name, his amanuensis or whatever, that they're collectively writing. So that what I think we're seeing in the letter of 1 Corinthians is essentially he's regretting giving women a voice. And he's doing a lot of backpedaling, or very subtly telling women to get back in line, or to there's some form of repeatedly over and over and over rhetorical move, putting a judgment on, or a lid on women and their autonomy or their voices, what it is, the messages they are bringing, something like that. And it's not clear. But I'm not getting to my point as clearly as I thought I would right away. I think that the letter of 1 Corinthians is much less egalitarian towards women than what I wanted it to be in the way I've published it, like in Permission Granted. I made a really strong move to try to show people how to read this letter, particular chapters 11 and 14, through this lens of Paul is actually for women. And I wanted that to be true. And so I found a way to make that true. And I had people, I remember listening to a colleague, not by name, but call me out on that at SBL in the paper, right? And I, at the time that I heard that, was like, but I'm reading the way David Odell Scott is reading this. Like it's point counterpoint. Like this is what they're saying, but this is, and it took some time before I could go back and look at it more clearly. So I think that what we're seeing is a male with a lot of privilege who wanted something really ideal. And then when it started to play out, he didn't like the way it looked. He didn't like the way it was playing out because women had different ideas than he did or whatever. And so there's some backpedaling here in 1 Corinthians. So my point is, even the genuine Paul is not as positive on women as I would like him to be, as I know that a lot of people have said that he is. And I understand why they think that and how they get there and all of that. But I think that there's enough going on if we are willing to see it, if we're willing to sit with it, that shows that even the genuine Paul essentially had regrets about empowering women.
Thank you. This is kind of, so when I saw your original conversation with Jacob, and that was a little bit of my takeaway. I'm also very much indebted to Antoinette Wire's book for slightly different things, maybe not her holistic arguments, but she does an incredible job of looking at the way, particularly the texts around 1 Corinthians were corrupted to harmonize with it. So like she describes, in your previous interview, you said she mentioned a lot of the manuscript histories. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what when I was writing my article that was published 2 years ago on this topic, I was really indebted to her book for that reason, because she noted, for example, that the authors of the Pauline forgeries, they don't always have the same grammar and the same usage and mechanical issues in their structure of their epistles that the authentic epistles do. And she noted that the Western editors, we talk about manuscript types or manuscript traditions, and they used to think that they were really clear cut, like Alexandrian, Byzantine, Western were like silos for ancient manuscripts that didn't really cross fertilize each other. Now we have enough comprehensive view of like the vast number of different ancient manuscripts that we recognize that at most of those text types blur together. So you have Byzantine texts and Alexandrian texts that they're not like, the earlier you get, the less easy they are to sort into those categories. But the one exception is the Western type. The Western type is clearly a different early text stream that is distinct from most non-Western texts by the late 2nd century. And so there are significant ways that it's closer to the autographs, and there's significant ways that its corruptions are unique. They're like differences. Right. So when we talk about like that major, the one of these big displacements where you got that problematic verse in 14, 34 and 35, it jumps to the end of the chapter in the Western tradition entirely. All the Western tradition has that displacement. The only non-Western ones that do it are later Byzantines that are probably influenced by the Western, because in the medieval period, you had a lot back and forth between Constantinople and Rome. You had a lot of like clerical reassignments and migrate. You had popes from Greece that were in Italy and back and forth. So in other words, by the 11th and 12th century, you had the potential for Western forms to influence Byzantine forms. Whereas in the earliest manuscripts, you have like just that funky displacement where why does this jump over to here? It only happens in the Western text stream. And so what Wire noted is that the Western text stream is also the place where you get subtle grammatical changes to make real Paul sound more like fake Paul. Sound more, not in terms of his agenda, not in terms of his overall like rhetoric, but more like just like saying, well, let's use this verb tense here, or let's make this, a plural instead of singular, so that the parallel passages in 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy read like they're the same author, as opposed to sounding a little bit different linguistically. So my point here is that she is somebody who is very well aware of the holistic kind of editorial trajectory. So it's not just that these texts are static objects, and it's not that we have to say any particular passage is an interpolation. The subtlest shifts in meaning are possible through these tiny little changes. Like you were talking about what are some other examples of interpolations in this one, when Paul in 1 Corinthians says he appeared to the 12, right? That disagrees with Matthew, who says he only appeared to 11. Guess what the Western editors did? Jennifer, I can't hear you.
I can't hear you either.
Oh dear.
Now I can
I hear you now.
Okay.
You're back. So it sounded like you were trying to get a word in edgewise, and I was like, okay.
Well, kind of, because I want to make sure that this is a productive conversation for people watching us.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if what we're talking about is clear to everyone, and I'd like to establish some of that for people.
I apologize. I apologize.
Well,
I can do that. It's like my Achilles heel.
So I just want to be clear, though. I just want to be clear, though. What you're talking about is much smaller than what Wire is talking about. She's talking about the whole letter and how segment after segment. I mean, she breaks the letter of 1 Corinthians down. The first chapter is actually really rich. The first 25 pages, talking about different types of arguments that Paul is using throughout the letter, 4 different types of arguments. And then she breaks it into 1 Corinthians chapters 1 through 4, chapters 5 through 7, as we know, around sexualities, chapters 8 through 11. She have a separate chapter talking about 1 Corinthians 11, 2 to 6, and then chapters 12 to 14, chapters 15 and 16. Like, she breaks down the whole letter and shows us how throughout the letter of 1 Corinthians, Paul's rhetoric is negative toward these women prophets, and that they are a significant component of the reason for writing this letter. It's not that they're the only ones, obviously, because there are all these topics and issues that he's addressing, responding to, he's heard about, they've written him about, whatever. But women prophets come up throughout this letter, or they are implied throughout the letter in his rhetoric, and he is negative toward them. That, to me, is a bigger issue and an important place to start, because I don't disagree with your comments about what the Western tradition, I don't even know all the language around text criticism, to be honest, because I started like grasping it when I was in graduate school, and I was like, yeah, this is important stuff, but I don't have the mental I don't want to focus on text criticism. But so the Western traditions, the textual tradition of the Western, the Latin, the 2 language traditions or manuscripts, like I don't disagree with your observations, and that others have made as well, about there's a significant change that happens with these subtle revisions, right? And she does talk about that. But she is also making what I think is a stunningly more powerful observation, which is that the genuine Paul is negative toward women who were prophets in the Corinthian location. And we are not talking about that as scholars or in general. There are plenty of scholars talking about it. There's a book that just came out after the Corinthian women prophets. And I was actually taken to task in one of those chapters because I wasn't taking Wire seriously enough, just so we're all clear.
And I was looking through a recent anthology of, a 30th. Is that the 30th anniversary volume that you're talking about? There was a 2020 project that involved a bunch of scholars that were coming together to look at the impact of the work and everything. There
was a Festschrift in her.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm thinking of. Yeah, I was checking out a few of those titles in preparation for this. And so I think that there's absolutely no doubt that this is an incredibly important conversation. And I am not here to defend defend Paul against holistic arguments about his sexism. I have had problems with other parts of the Pauline corpus as well. It's been something that, so like, let's get back. You mentioned Odell Scott. He was my undergraduate mentor. So I've been familiar with his work since I was taking my first introduction to comparative religion class, like as a freshman. And he was my thesis advisor. So I came back to this after a career in where I've done a lot of other things. I've taught basically in undergraduates for a decade and been mostly a part-time employee. So my scholarship was kind of languishing for a decade or more. And then I came back and I saw some debates about whether the passage was an interpolation or not.
Right.
Those debates, particularly among egalitarian Paulists. So these would be Paulists who assume that Paul is egalitarian, and they're trying to account for the existence of this problematic passage by one or another means.
So can we talk about what the passage is? I'm very sensitive to talking about something that people don't understand.
Oh, yeah. I feel like I'm stepping into a conversation that was already started. Sorry.
Well,
my apologies. So
it would be nice if we could like maybe read the passage, or I don't know, Jacob,
I have it
here to put that up on the screen at Biblegate or whatever website you use to show. I don't want to impose my way of doing things on you.
I didn't bring like a slideshow, but
so it's 1 Corinthians 14 verses 34 and 35 is what we keep referring to, but one of us could just read it if that's easier.
I will in 1 second as soon as
Jacob? I'm not sure what Jacob wants to do.
Okay, so
that's fine.
I'm going to read it.
Okay.
So, and there's a lot of text critical problems with it. There's a lot of text critical problems with it in terms of its the way it's conventionally broken up, where the verse partitions go affect its meaning. So there isn't like a universally agreed upon framing for it. But the way that most modern Bibles do it is they lump it in with verse 33. So this is chapter 14, verse 33b is often where modern Bibles started. And that is not text critically correct, but it's conventional in English. So they say, so it begins with 33b. As in all the churches of the saints, the women should keep silence in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, even as the law says. If there is anything they desire to know, let them ask their husband at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. And then I need to read, and that's the passage that gets displaced. But what's the following passage matters a lot. The following passage goes like this, and it can be translated a couple different ways, but the one way that, for example, most English Bibles from the late 19th century to the early 20th century used, until the very later modern period when the conventions shifted a little bit. And so I'm quoting from the Revised Standard Version of 1946. What? Did the word of God originate with you, or are you the only ones it has reached? So this is the entire. So the problematic passage is really 34 and 35, but the material immediately before it in 33b is often put together like it's one sentence when it's not. And then 36 can be translated different ways to soften or harden what is the disjunctive particle heta there. So it's a disjunctive particle heta. It's like the Greek letter H or E. It's just a little inconspicuous little particle, but it makes a big difference how you translate it into English, whether you translate it as an epithet, or merely a conjunction, or, right? That decision of a translator has an impact on how the text reads.
And just to be clear for folks, this comes in the middle of a section where they're talking about, so I'm going to back up to verse 26.
Go for it. Yes, go for it.
What should be done then, my friends? I'm reading the NRSV, not the updated edition, but when you come together, each one has a hymn, a lesson, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Let all things be done for building up. If anyone speaks in a tongue, let there be only 2 or at most 3, and each in turn, and let one interpret. But if there's no one to interpret, let them be silent in church and speak to themselves and to God. Let 2 or 3 prophets speak, and let the others weigh what is said. If a revelation is made to someone else sitting nearby, let the first person be silent. For you can all prophesy one by one, so that all may learn and all be encouraged. And the spirits of prophets are subject to the prophets. For God is a God not of disorder, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. And then this piece about women, be silent, are they not permitted, and yada yada. If there's something to desire to know, let them ask their man at home. And then verse 36, where did the word of God originate with you? So I would like to say that based on David Odell Scott's scholarship, I took that reading and I used that and I debated with my editor. She did not want to hear what I had to say. She didn't agree with me. But I read it the way you're suggesting, quoting this ridiculous idea, women, should be silent, just ask at home. And then the refutation, what, are you kidding me? Did it originate with you? And what Wire is suggesting on this passage is that she goes into all the depth about why she believes it's original and not, elsewhere.
Which I agree with 100%.
Right, sure.
I'm not an interpolation proponent on this passage. It is in the oldest possible manuscript tradition, for sure.
Right. But she points out how as elsewhere, there's a reference to the general people when anyone speaks in a tongue, do these things, and then the focus on the prophets, and then a focus on women. And so she's suggesting that we read that there's this openness toward people speaking in tongues, and then when there are prophets speaking, do this, and then women need to be silent. And that then instead of it being the Ada, as you referenced at the beginning of verse 36, or did the word of God originate with you? What did the word of God originate? Like, those are the two ways of handling that, right?
Right.
Her reading is that it's did the word of God originate with you? Like, shut your trap and sit down. Right. So that's her reading of it, is that it is original. And as in other places of this letter, the women are being talked about in ways that it's negative. It is telling them to sit down and shut up. And I wanted it to be the other. I really wanted it to be, what? Did it originate with you? What? I did, because I like that. I'd prefer that Paul be more open-minded. But I think that when I started reading Antoinette Clark Wire's book, and I didn't have the mental space to take in every single detail to be able to regurgitate it for others, but I knew that what she was doing was, she was doing honest, consistent scholarship, and that it builds throughout the letter, so that before you get to 14, we're already feeling negative towards these women who are prophets, or maybe not even prophets, but women speaking. So that this is just that these comments about women should be being silent in the churches is actually him. It is actually what he's trying to say. He is actually trying to tell them, these women in particular, that they need to be quiet. They need to stop speaking, because they are teaching or speaking about things that he doesn't approve of.
Yes. Okay. I understand. So allow me to provide a bit of a defense of the Odell Scott reading. By the way, Odell Scott, he arrived at this reading based on the Greek grammar independently, but he is not the first to publish this particular quotation refutation structure. He is one of 4 to 5 independent authors, all coming out of the English-speaking world since the late 19th century, who have independently noticed that by using quotation marks and bracketing, and in other words, defining who's speaking where, that this reading, the quotation refutation reading, flows naturally out of the Greek, and there are other examples of him that are unambiguous quotation refutation. In other words, this is something Paul does. It's
I understand. I agree with you,
that he likes to quote and refute people, but he does it in ways that are often very hard to detect. And it's not just here that many of his quotation refutation hypotheses lead to, or quotation refutation situations lead to, and this is why I say that Paul is a problem. Like, if I could go back and beat him up to get him to do a better job, But that sounds too violent. I'm sorry. But he's an angry person. He's got a big old chip on his shoulder. He's constantly grumpy and he's constantly getting into kind of these rhetorical debates with people. And he forgets that his audience is more than just the audience that he's writing to. So I think a lot of the problem with Paul is that he's writing to very specific people who are well aware of the context of their debate. And that we, coming later, especially coming after the 2nd century editors got a hold of his texts and did a lot of little changes, we get to see something where we don't know what the people's like frame of mind who were receiving the letter were, and they would have known what their original letter said. So the contents of the lost first letter from the Corinthians, because he's responding to a letter that his female emissary has brought to him. He is sending one of his women back and forth between the congregation and him, and he is sending her, she's the courier, and she's bringing his response. So the people receiving the letter will know exactly what they wrote. And he didn't need to, well, it's also possible that editors have obscured those plies. The partitions between sections, that was often how things were read. So the ancient letters would have been read aloud, and the person reading it would know how to read it. And sometimes, like, some manuscripts would have had, like, I don't know, annotations or, little, like, marks to show where things were broken up and to kind of give the reader a clue. But if the reader was coming from a reading tradition, they would ignore those marks. They would have their own way of reading stuff. So it meant that very quickly, like as early as a generation after Paul, there are major disputes over what Paul is saying. Like these very ambiguous passages that are very hard to read and interpret in context are because of the lack of punctuation in Greek and the fact that everything just blends together into this kind of difficult to disentangle mess. So my point is that beginning in the 19th century, which was a time when there were a lot of women church leaders in the West, it was the proto-feminist movement in the late 19th century where you had the women's suffrage movement and the early abolitionist scholars who were working in the original Greek. And they were like, whoa, look at this. And they picked up on these grammatical clues. And it was they published it first in pamphlets in the 19th century. One of the first major women-led translation projects, the Montgomery New Testament, used the QR structure in the published Bible. Right. So
New Testament. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
The Montgomery New Testament. I think it's 1924. So this was
so not the first, but one of them.
No, one of them. I shouldn't say that.
The women's Bible.
I'm sure there were plenty of. You're right. I was speaking out of turn. I don't know for sure.
That's right. I just wanted to know because I'm not familiar.
She was a pioneering publisher of a Greek New Testament in modern English, right? And she, based on her exposure to 19th century pamphlets arguing for the QR structure, she used all she did was translate the text and use quotation marks and brackets to indicate who was speaking where. And that's how she indicated the quotation refutation. And this was not something that Odell Scott knew about or any of the other 5 or 6 20th century critical scholars who independently, without citing earlier exegesis, they independently came up with it themselves. So the fact that it's been like it in modern English-speaking communities, it's been noticed several times by several different people across the political spectrum, conservatives, liberals, Catholics, Protestants, they've all noticed this independently. That's one thing to point. And then the other thing, and I don't think Wire addresses this, correct me if I'm wrong, but the problem is in verse 36, the pronoun gender changes. So the masculine plural pronoun is used for only ones. So, and masculine means there must be at least some men in the it's possible it's a neuter use of the pronoun. I mean, it can be used, but if it's referring to a group of exclusively women, then in ancient Greek, you wouldn't use the masculine pronoun, you would use the feminine one. So the group that he's saying, are you the only ones it has reached to, could be either all the men or a group that consists of men and women. It cannot be, whereas a number of complementarian, a number of like the sort of keep women in their place translators, they purposely imply that he's referring to only ones exclusively women. right? So they're kind of twisting the grammar to exclude the in other words, they're reading it through an English-speaking lens where we don't have gendered plural pronouns. But the gendered plural pronoun is what is the red flag for these Bible translators in the modern period who says, wow, Paul's talking to somebody else in verse 36 besides the women. And
but I don't think that undermines Wire's point, which is that the 34 and 35 are still telling women to be quiet. Because if 36 then is responding to that whole section ahead of time, then it's, people speaking in tongues do this way, prophets speaking this way, and women doing this. What, or did it all come to you first? Like, I'm not sure that undermines the bigger point that Wire is trying to make, which is he is still being negative towards women here.
Well, okay, so here,
and in fact, the other big quotation refutation that I'm aware of in 1 Corinthians is 1 Corinthians 11, 2-16. And I do still think you can read it as quotation refutation, but I think we need to take seriously some of the refutation he uses is still quite sexist and negative towards men.
Yes, if you take it serious, if you take it as deadpan, if you take it as he's playing the straight man. But another problem with Paul and what makes Paul a headache is Paul, I believe, is always using sarcasm and irony. And that means that sometimes we are failing to note when he is strawmanning, when he's mocking a position and this is especially problematic. This is one of the reasons why Paul is susceptible to this misreading because there's two completely diametrically opposite readings and they're both defensible. They're both grammatically defensible. So therefore, Paul has created something that is a cipher. He's a cipher. In other words, you can take Paul and read through him whatever you want to believe there. And this is because of the way the real Paul wrote it, right? He made this document that is really inscrutable for people who are not part of the original community. If you could go back and be a member of that congregation, then it would make sense to you because he was responding directly to something that you wrote.
I think maybe this particular piece would make more sense if we were looking at the text, because I jumped from 1 Corinthians 14 over to 1 Corinthians 11, and I'm thinking of the places where he's saying, indeed, man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for the sake of woman, but woman for the sake of man. And then in verse 12, for just as woman came from man, so man comes through woman, but all things come from God. So he's not actually, he is offering a different reading, and it's kind of don't forget this, but he's also not negating the other stance, which is very sexist and is a misreading of Genesis 2 and 3, which is what Paul does throughout his letters, and in particular in the book of Romans. He misreads very intentionally and very negatively for humanity, not just for women, for humanity in Genesis 2 and 3. So I would love for 1 Corinthians 11 to also be endorsing women, but I don't think it is either. And that's because I had to take Wire seriously. And I do think that he does still say right at the end, I still point people to say, but he's like, yeah, but you guys need to stop fighting over this. So he's saying whatever your thing is about women and head coverings and whatever, stop fighting about it. But he is still not undermining the sexism
Excuse me, I have a kid in the room.
in the exchange that he's having.
Okay, sorry. My son's asking for my phone. I don't remember where I put it. Excuse me. Your mom needs it?
Yes.
All right. Well, I'll pause and find it in a second. I think here it is. I got it. I apologize. My 15-year-old is asking me for something. I didn't expect that. All right.
It's part of life.
Yeah, my apologies. Okay, so I agree that we have to take that seriously. I've struggled with these holistic questions since I was exposed. I was convinced by the QR argument from very early in my career, but the reason why I wrote the article I wrote was because it took me a long time to figure out how it worked in historical context, given that there's all these other issues. In other words, it's part of a whole constellation of problematic passages, and particularly that all have complex interrelationships with the Deutero-Pauline stuff,
Sure,
right?
I agree.
Of which there is some flagrant forgeries and some not so flagrant ones that are like, so in other words, it forms a kind of a big muddy gray area with
Sure,
a lot of material wait, sorry.
I'm sorry, I keep stepping on you. Keep it going. I'm sorry.
I just wanted to say that I agree with you that I think Paul is an egalitarian. The historical Paul is an egalitarian, although how egalitarian he is, right? How egalitarian is absolutely not something that a hill I'm willing to die on. And I think you're absolutely right that his decision to glad hand, I think that he's quoting and refuting some very, very sexist congregants, but he glad handles them. And he embeds their quotes in such ways that he doesn't necessarily, like his refutation of verses 34 and 35 is clear and unambiguous. It's one of his most forceful refutations in the letter, in my opinion. But the stuff in in chapter 11, I agree with you that he kind of refutes it, but it kind of it makes it very hard to see. And I think it's because he was being cheeky in a way that goes over most people's heads, even ancient readers. I believe that, in other words, that's a problem. It's a problem.
Okay, there are two things that you said. One is that I'm going to start with the 11, because when he says, just as woman came from man, so man comes through woman, like, don't forget, women actually bring all people into the world, but all things come from God. So the issue here, in my opinion, is that he's not, well,
fixing my cord.
Okay.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. I don't have a hill to die on with Paul, because I actually don't give a rat's ass what he says. And I actually really want people to take that seriously, that his ideas are ancient and need to be set aside, or we need to address them. But okay, so you're suggesting that in 1 Corinthians 11, he's being cheeky. Okay, you say that women came from men, but don't forget man comes through woman. But when you go to, and all things come from God, right? You're not actually addressing this sexism that came before. So you're suggesting that he's a little too subtle, and so we misunderstand that he's being that he's rooting for women. Is that what you're saying?
So can we back up a little bit and look at a tiny bit of the big picture here in terms of the way these texts were being read, and how we know that through evidence, because these are some of Galatians, 1 Corinthians, Romans. These are some of the oldest Christian documents that survive. They're some of the most widely cited ones. 1 Corinthians in particular is cited. I think it's a candidate for being the most heavily cited early Christian text in terms of the 2nd century Christians showing evidence that they knew the text, right? Like, so authors of the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, they show awareness of Christian literature. And this document, this letter we're talking about, is one of the biggest, most widespread, most well-known Christian documents in the first Christian centuries. And yet, the conventional reading about women as being subordinated by Paul does not appear anywhere in any literature until the time of Tertullian and later. So all early authorities, now hold on, except for
I don't understand what I'm supposed to do with that data point.
I'm sorry. So what I'm trying to say, with one exception, that is 1 Timothy. So clearly the early pastoral forgeries recognized the sexist reading. But for example, Clement of Alexandria, these people.
I don't want to talk about them, Joe. I want to talk about the text, because I think that we disagree fundamentally about the text and how to read it. And I don't care what early readers did with it.
Okay.
The argument here that's being made that people are publishing book after book on is whether or not Paul is like the genuine Paul. What do we do with him? And I don't care what the early guys did with him, because as you said, the Western tradition very much made sexist edits and all those kinds of things. I want to talk about the fact that the quotation refutation reading is still not as egalitarian as I think I would like it to be, and as I think you're implying that it is.
Well, so that's all quite fair. I'm not at all.
I thought that's what we were here to discuss.
Yeah, it is. Well, it absolutely is.
And I think that you've misunderstood what Wire is saying about the Corinthians chapter 14 piece, because she also does not think it's an interpolation, but she reads the rhetoric, she reads the grammar, just like in other parts of 1 Corinthians, and does not read it the way you or David Odell Scott do. And she reads it as negative. So you made a claim a few minutes ago that it's very clear that Paul is standing with women in that. And I do not think it's clear. I would like it to be positive towards women, but I have to agree with Wire and her very thorough scholarship that it's not.
Absolutely not questioning the thoroughness of Wire's scholarship. She was writing in 1990 before.
But you didn't know her book's thesis. You didn't, and it's okay that people do that all the time. We go look at one chapter and we use.
I did know that she wasn't in favor of the quotation refutation hypothesis. I knew that she was arguing that the Corinthian women prophets were being subjugated in this epistle. But I was telling you that I am interested in the fact I was drawn to her work because of her deft handling of the manuscript traditions and showing an editorial trajectory. So this editorial trajectory doesn't happen instantly. It's not like it happens 5 minutes from now. What we see and I'm an archaeologist, and all the material culture that we're seeing from the early Christian centuries right now is refuting the idea that the early church was totally male dominated. So we're seeing plenty of examples of women clergy in early Christian burials. We're seeing plenty of examples of women depicted as clergy in early Christian art. Right. We're seeing evidence that a lot of very sexist things in medieval writing are anachronistic forgeries, like things that are told, like, this guy said this, but in fact it was written later by someone putting that word in his mouth. So in other words, there's a holistic tendency that takes place over 600 or 700 years where the role of women as leaders in the early church is systematically undermined gradually, not overnight. So my point about the early fathers, if you bear with me, is valid for one reason, and that is this epistle is cited extensively. And when it's cited on terms of gender, about gender, it's cited not to say women have to be silent. It's only 1 Timothy that's cited that way. And when 1 Timothy is cited that way in conjunction with 1 Corinthians, that's when the normative reading that we're all familiar with, the one that the Southern Baptists use. So it's been around since Tertullian, but there is no evidence that reading existed before Tertullian when he combined 1 Timothy with 1 Corinthians and created a kind of a canon law. He basically took the parallel passages in those two epistles, read them together, and made them a rule for the church. And that was when the church started to say, this is Paul's final word on this subject. And he did it with a heavily corrupted manuscript tradition where the passage had been displaced and sheltered away from the refutation of verse 36. So the entire Western manuscript tradition at the time of Tertullian lacked the canonical version of this manuscript, which is the basis for the Odell Scott reading. There was nobody reading the regular version. And one more point I want to make about the structure of the text is that 33b, that's a modern English tacked on verse, right? As in all the churches of the saints. By putting that in the same sentence with verse 34, they're universalizing the mandate, right? They're taking what could have been, at least potentially, read as a situational contextual thing, right? And when modern theologians want to say, as in all the churches of the saints, they're saying what they're saying. They're saying this rule applies to everyone, everywhere, all the time. And that's absolutely wrong, because we know from all the ancient manuscripts that there is a big section break there. That line is a closing section for the previous passage. That as in all the churches of the saints is absolutely formulaic Paul's conclusion. So there needs to be a new idea starting after that verse, which is how I answer your critique of the 36 referring to stuff that's earlier than that. There's already been a concluding passage. The verse 36 only refers to 34 and 35. It doesn't refer to the stuff that is already been wrapped up by 33, which is the previous section. It's thematically linked. You're right that Wire's discussion of the progression of rhetorical topics, getting to women now. It's more like, oh, here's what I think. It's more like here, and by the way, on the topic that you're writing about, here's what I have to say. And there's one or two more key issues about the passage. One is his invocation of the law. It's extremely problematic. Paul is not somebody who invokes the law in a positive sense. He doesn't cite the law as his authority very often. He usually talks about works of the law as not what are important for the Gentiles. And this is a predominantly Gentile congregation.
For sure.
The Jewish Christians that we know of in this congregation include the people who were Paul's women, like Priscilla, who was an occasional visitor. In other words, women, Jews, were allowed to speak in synagogues, and as Bruton has demonstrated with inscriptional evidence, Jewish women owned synagogues. Jewish women definitely spoke in synagogues, and there's nothing in the book of in the Hebrew Bible that says women aren't allowed to speak in the assemblies. Where does that law come from? That is Greco-Roman law. It is absolutely goes back to Aristotle. There are dozens and dozens of examples of laws forbidding women to speak in the assemblies in Greco-Roman law. And so the citation of the law as justifying women's silence and subordination is coming from a Gentile perspective, not a Jewish one. It's citing a clear, literally the language in the passage is mechanistically similar to codified Greco-Roman laws. So when you understand that, the following verse makes perfect sense to me as, what did the word of God originate with you, or did you, masculine plural, alone receive it? Because what would Paul be doing there? He is saying that's not a law that God cares about. That's not a law. You're talking about something else besides the word of God. And so I think that is absolutely something that gets ironed over very quickly, that people lose track, that we lose the thread, right? Very early on. Certainly the pastoral forgeries indicate, right, that reading, which I'm favoring here, was not universally held at all, right? That there was an early recognition of that. And so why does the passage get put to the end of the chapter in the Western tradition, which is the one major...
Can we not get into that? Do you mind if we don't get into that?
That's the thing that Antoinette Wire never read because it wasn't published until 2000.
I'm saying, do you mind if we don't get into that? Because she does address it. I think she addresses it very nicely. And
well, in 1990, that hadn't been, that article.
I'm trying to say, Joe, that it is irrelevant to the bigger conversation that I'm trying to invite us to have, which is that the letter of 1 Corinthians in general is negative toward women.
Okay, so let me ask you a question.
I hear the way you are reading it, and I agree that is a way to read 33, 34, and 34, 5, and 6. I see that. I see what you're saying. I also see Antoinette Clark Wire's scholarship, and I think that she is making she's making an important point. And if what is happening in this one section, he is saying it's ridiculous to silence the women in the churches, I think that's important. That might be what's happening, but I think that given that there is a consistent agenda throughout the letter, that might actually not be true. Like on its own, that to me makes the most sense is what you've said. But given the letter as a whole, that he is building up time and again and negatively putting down women, specifically women speaking, that makes me wonder if in chapter 14, he actually does mean it. And I don't know what to do with it. Here's the thing. I don't think there's a way to iron this out because you and I are not going to come to an agreement today. And I don't want us to. I want us to have our own ways of handling this. But I feel like you missed the bigger picture, which is a really important claim because biblical scholars, Pauline scholars, are not taking her work on this particular letter seriously enough. people want to have the arguments over a textual issue. Chapter 14, 34 to 36, chapter 11, 2 to 16, and we want to argue over it. And we want to make sure we understand what Paul was or wasn't doing so that we can make a claim if he was sexist or not. And I don't like saying any person is sexist. I like saying that they might say some sexist things. They might have sexist tendencies, but I don't like saying that a person in general is sexist, because even some people who are like often have moments of, support of people. People who are sexist at times also are not always sexist, is my point. I don't think that, but part of why I wanted to do this conversation is I appreciate that what you're saying about chapter 14 verses 34 to 36. I do. And I see your point. I'm not convinced when I take the whole letter into consideration. I'm not convinced because I look at what Paul does even in chapter 11. I think you're right. Like he's quoting a sexist idea and then he challenges it, but he doesn't fully undermine it. And then he follows it with that verse about women and, and what is natural for men and women. And he doesn't, again, I feel like we're talking about things that people don't necessarily know what we're talking about. This whole thing about head covering and whether or not women should, and what's natural, and it doesn't, just that men are supposed to, yada yada. And I know that you've said, right, maybe he's actually tongue in cheek there.
He's bald.
Right,
he's bald, and people think of him as bald and ugly. And so when he says, "Isn't it natural for men to have short hair?" And by the way, early Christian depictions of Jesus with long and feminine hair often have Paul, even though he never met the guy. Art always shows bald-headed Paul talking to long-haired Jesus. And so that's why early Christian people were like, that's a joke. He's making a joke at his own expense. There's also, as Wire notes in her later scholarship, there's puns there. He uses the head as a pun. He's kind of making dad jokes and kind of lame dad jokes. If you don't, there's clearly like he's got this kind of shtick that's hard for us to get because we don't know that if only we had that first letter. The fact is he's responding. It's the part 2 in an exchange where we don't have part 1, and part 1 would be like, it would answer all these questions or help to answer all these questions for us, because we could see exactly where the connections are between what he is responding to and his response.
I agree. I'd like to read the verses that we're alluding to so people can hear.
And can I ask you one more question real quick after you do that? I'd love to talk about chapter 11, but really quickly, I'm curious because I see what she talks about in the rest of the epistle as being much subtler. I see 11 and this horrible passage in 14 as being the thorniest parts. As far as the other stuff goes, I think her article, her arguments about the rhetorical context are brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And I see that they are absolutely worthy of respect. I'm curious if you could cite, after we talk about 11, before we wrap up, I know we're probably running out of time, but after you talk about 11, can you mention some other parts of the epistle that are not in either of these passages, which are clearly sexist? Because that would help me to understand your point of view better, and Wire's, frankly, because you're right. I haven't read her book or I didn't read it carefully enough, as you say, and I haven't read it in a while.
Okay, so the thing that we're referring to in chapter 11 is this thing about head coverings and whether or not women should cover their heads. And the thing is, you're right, we didn't come into this conversation to fully address chapter 11, but I think that simply leaving chapter 11 as quotation refutation does not fully address all the sexism. Maybe I'll just leave it at that for now, because there are too many pieces in it that are not being countered. It's a long section. Chapter verses 2 to 16 is a long section, and there's one or maybe 2 refutations, and there's a lot of sexist language throughout that segment. The passage about nature starts in verse 14. Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is dishonoring to him? long hair versus no hair is not what's going on here. It's long hair versus short. And when you say that he's poking at himself, I'm not sure that that plays out, because this is an issue of long versus short, or long versus not at all. I'm not sure how to, I like what you're trying to do, because I would like it to be true, but I'm not sure that it works, right? Does not nature itself teach you? Actually, as we know, it's not nature, it's custom. Like, isn't it customary here for a man to have short hair because long hair is dishonoring to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for her hair is given to her for a covering. So what is he playing with? What is he asserting? It isn't entirely clear to me. And he doesn't challenge that customarily women have hair, it is her glory, and her hair is her covering. And customarily men have short hair. And then he says, if anyone is disposed to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. So he's throwing out the entire issue by saying this isn't our custom, but he does not, in my opinion, fully address all the sexism that is in this passage. So whether or not he's trying to say something positive by saying get rid of the head covering thing altogether, he's still not fully unpacking or dismantling the sexism that is in their thinking.
100% agree. And that's why we have head coverings. That's why ancient Christians covered their heads. It's why modern Muslims do. Honestly, it's because when the Islamic Empire took over the Byzantine world, in the expansion of Islam out of Arabian Peninsula and into the Byzantine world, they assimilated a bunch of Eastern Christians for whom the head covering rule, which is mandated by Paul, right, is normal, and it becomes culturally transferred from ancient Christianity to Islam. So absolutely right that verse 11, chapter 11 is incredibly early on, is read in the way that we read it today, as Paul saying women cover their head in church. And that is 100% Paul's fault. I am not, Paul did that. Paul wrote this thing, and he made that. Yeah, and that's what I'm saying.
That's not what I'm saying.
I'm saying. I'm sorry. Paul made this mistake.
He actually is undermining and throwing out head coverings in that passage. And separately, he is not challenging the sexism within their thinking.
That's
two
right.
different things. Two different things.
And people read it wrong in the sense that they now read it to establish the use of head coverings. So they read what is the quote, the quotation portion as Paul, and therefore they read it in addition to him not throwing them out. In other words, that was his problem. He left the door open. He left the door wide open. And so I think that is, I agree with you that Paul is full of problems, and that is one of the big ones. And that Christianity's problems go back to the problems that were put there by Paul. So I'm not here to defend Paul's character holistically. I do see, though, that the historical Paul, when we talk about his holistically thing, he is associated with women in ministry very early on, women who were publicly speaking.
I think what you're ignoring, because I love the fact that Romans chapter 16 has a whole bunch of women. Like, I love that, right?
Not just Romans.
But what I feel like you're not hearing me on is that regardless of what Paul is saying about head coverings in 11, and regardless of this other piece in 14, throughout the letter, he is negative toward women.
So give me some examples.
Please do not interrupt me right now.
Sorry.
Chapter 11, he does not dismantle all of the sexist crap in there. He does say we don't have a head covering thing, so let's move on. But he's allowing the sexist ideas to remain. This is the issue with Paul. Throughout his letters, he is sexist, he is hierarchical, he is power over, he uses judging and shaming, he uses dualistic language to put people in place, to control people, to tell them what to think and what to believe. He uses rhetorical moves, as I know you are well familiar with, to try to coerce people into doing and thinking what he wants. Throughout his letters, the rhetoric is offensive, it is harmful, and it is dangerous. regardless of head coverings or not, Paul's 1 Corinthians letter is not, as a whole, positive toward women. People get hung up on these two little things and say, see, he's positive. But even within the exchange itself, he has not been positive, or he has let sexist ideas remain. That is my point. That people can say that they're pro-women, but they don't understand all of the things that they're doing that are undermining that at the same time. That's what I'm trying to get at. People all the time, there are so many people that I know today who think that they are pro-women, and so much of what they do in the day-to-day is not. So much of the way they behave toward women is actually sexist or judgmental or hateful towards women, and they don't get it. They don't see it, but they want to be pro-women, but they're not in all the 99% of the time. That's what I'm trying to say. People want to, people constantly say, well, the genuine Paul is pro-women. I'm like, yeah, he wanted to be, maybe. He started out pro-women, but at the end, he was really irritated at times. And it wasn't subtle. If you look at what Wire is pointing out in the first 4 chapters of her book, it isn't subtle. And I actually can't point to all these things right now. First of all, It's a deep read. You need to read it and consider it.
I agree.
And I don't want.
I agree that it is a deep read.
I do have a question. My first question here is for Jennifer Bird. So basically, what you're saying is that people miss the links, and that's why you keep saying we have to look at the whole letter, and not just those little parts, but the whole thing, because they link. They flow to make the larger point that you're trying to point out. That's basically what you're trying to suggest.
That's the main thing, yes. That throughout the letter, he is setting up women and telling them to be quiet, or some form of enmity toward them. Yes.
And because some just look at a couple or less than a handful of verses, and they base the whole discussion around that, it can lead to a misconception that Paul is pro-women, when that's not necessarily what's going on.
Right. Exactly. Paul and his, I was trying to find something that I could read from her book that would be helpful, but it's hard because it's not a simple thing to say and a simple thing to address.
I agree.
But the fine, like when Paul this final sentence at the end, it says, and then conclusion before she talks about the postscript or whatever. She's like, as Marshall shows, Paul's, I'm interpolating and paraphrasing point, Paul's rhetoric, the result of Paul's rhetoric is enmity toward women. That is the result overall in the letter of 1 Corinthians. Women are being treated that way. Like there's enmity toward women.
All right. I understand. I understand the point, and I understand that she is a master scholar, and that her overall rhetorical treatment of the letter as a whole is powerful and it's important. And I am going to, and the one of the linchpins in her argument is the fact that the passage in question, the most toxic, undoubtedly the most forthright curtailment of women's public leadership prerogative in the entire New Testament, probably both the Newer Testament and the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the entire thing. It is hard to find a passage more overtly hostile towards women than the one in chapter 14 that we're talking about. So while one of her
argument, though,
no, it's a piece of her argument. It's a piece of her argument is that it is authentic. It is Paul. It is real Paul. And so you're citing her conclusion about the rhetoric of the letter as a whole, and I'm not, and she is absolutely 100% on solid ground there. But she did publish this in 1990, and a lot of work has been published since 1990, and that is important. That in terms of the understanding the Western displacement is key here, because the Western displacement is Yeah, but it does. The Western displacement does matter. It shows that early people were made uncomfortable by the position, the juxtaposition of those two passages. Very early manuscript editors in the West were made very uncomfortable by the canonical verse location, and they sheltered that passage in the end of the chapter so that it is unambiguously, it's a conclusion to the chapter. The Western chapter ends with that. In other words, the rhetorical power of that verse in the Western edition is enormous. And that Western tradition is where we get our rules on this subject in the Western Church, because they became canon law before the canonical verse order was restored to the Western tradition in the Vulgate. So for the entirety of the first 1,000 years of Christianity, all Western readers were confronted with those verses out of their canonical position. So this matters for the history of Christianity. It is not insignificant. It is a significant fact that that displacement happens in the 2nd century in Italy and forms the basis for the rules of the church beginning after Constantine. It is, and we can see physical evidence that things were very different before. We can see physical evidence that women were leaders, women were prominent. In fact, it's one of the reasons why Christianity was attacked by outsiders. People like Celsus attacked Christianity because of the fact that it gave marginalized people leadership roles, including children, slaves, women, all that stuff. So there was hostility from the pagan world directed at Christianity because of things like the fact that women were allowed to lead. How did the pagans who eventually converted and turned it into a theocracy, right? The pagans who joined the movement and then made it their own, they domesticated it and they made it palatable to Greco-Roman law. And one of the ways they did that was by adding a ton of canonical forgeries and by taking the existing texts and chopping them up and rearranging them in ways that were compatible with these other readings. And all of the earliest exegetes we have on this passage are using the Western reading. None of the surviving exegetes of these passages are using the canonical reading. So therefore, we have no evidence at all and of this the normative reading before the time of Tertullian, meaning that, but we have, everybody is citing the epistle. And when they cite the epistle, like Clement says, Paul says women and men should be silent when prophesying. He doesn't mention women specifically. He doesn't cite this passage. And so that's why the church fathers are relevant, because they provide the only clues we have about the context of the way the letter was actually used. One more thing to mention real quick. The Marcionites and other radical Paulinists. All the radical, extreme Pauline sects that we know of in ancient world were extremely pro-women. So the Marcionites had prophesying sisters everywhere. We know of several groups of early Christians who were radical Paulinists who featured prominent women in leadership. It's the proto-Orthodox movement where you start to see that change a lot. And what are the key proto-Orthodox epistles? Like the pastoral epistles. The pastoral epistles are the proto-Orthodox people coming and making Paul into the Paul they want. And so while I see Wire's argument as
I don't think you do.
No,
I don't think you do, and that's okay because you haven't read her. Like, it's hard to read her and understand.
I have read her chapter on first. I have read her chapter on this.
I know you have,
14.
Joe. You haven't read the whole book and understood the book.
Correct.
Because it's heavy.
It is.
The point here is that most people haven't, and that's the point.
I agree, and I will go and I will.
You don't need to. I'm not asking you to. The point is that her point. That what you're saying about chapter 14 is not a linchpin. It is a piece of her conversation, but you could have her point without talking about chapter 14 in 1 Corinthians.
Chapter 14 and 11 together are very...
Hold on, Joe. Let's let Jennifer finish.
And that's okay.
I know. The other parts I would love to hear about. I would love to hear about things outside those two chapters. Thank you.
And my point is, she delineates it very nicely, as I said at the very beginning. She has a very thorough table of contents delineating all of the ways that Paul is negative toward women in his rhetoric throughout the letter.
So here's a question I have for you, Joe. And then in a moment, I'd like to ask a concluding question to both of you. There's a few super chats that have been waiting a while, so I want to pull them. It's not many, but just a few. So Joe, are you trying to make an argument that the texts of Paul have experienced heavy editing in order to make Paul appear more hostile towards women than he actually was. Is that what
Yes.
you're trying to suggest?
Yes, it's both editing and supplementing with canonical forgeries, and the canonical forgeries, if anything, have been more influential in this regard. So, like when people cite First Timothy, that is about women not teaching men. That's in some ways even more influential, right, in the history of the church at denying women's leadership.
No question.
And so, yeah. So the fact is, and we see it, and I beat up on the Western tradition a lot, but the Eastern manuscript traditions, the various Greek traditions that are not part of the old Latin world, they also have these problems, but they come in a different linguistic context. So the easiest thing to mention off the top of my head is the fact that women apostles get turned into men, and they get turned into men in different ways depending on whether you're in the Latin world or the Greek world. In the Latin-speaking world, foreign names that people didn't know they thought were men. So they turn Greek women with Greek names, become male apostles in the Latin texts. The opposite happens in the Greek texts. In places where Grecophone audiences were not familiar with Latin personal names, the names of women like Priscilla, she becomes a dude in all ancient Eastern commentaries of that period. So in other words, they gender swap apostles because of this idea that Paul couldn't possibly have women apostles that he sees in Christ beforehand. So that's one of many examples, but there's numerous these text corruptions which reinforce our readings of these texts and the conventional readings of these texts. So we in other words, we don't read real Paul by himself. We read real Paul through fake Paul. The fake Paul is the lens through which the Western Church has read fake Paul since the canon was established, which is a really big deal in understanding why we see Paul as a society the way we do.
And so my closing question that I would like Jennifer to first respond, and then after she's finished, you can answer, Joe.
Yes.
What is the best way that one should understand what Paul is trying to argue, or what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians?
Okay, so I'm actually not as interested in that question as I am in what's happening here. What are we trying to do with Paul? Why does it matter if we can do the quotation refutation and come out with something positive? Why does it help if we can say that Paul himself was egalitarian? I get all of those, the desires to do all of those things, but the point that I'm trying to raise here is that he was more sexist than most people realize. And in his letters themselves, throughout this letter, he is negative toward women. Does he have a moment that is difficult to interpret? Yes, there are two pretty big ones. And what I have written about elsewhere into chapters I'm pretty proud of, right? Talking about something and to what end. They're both linked on my website. The question in my mind is, why are we making such a mountain out of this, out of what Paul was? Why do we care what Paul was, what he believed or thought? Because when someone shows you who they are, believe them. And he shows you that he's sexist. And just like so many people, like look around you, the people you know, they might be nice from time to time, but when they're pushed, they get kind of sexist. And what I think Wire's point, what her book shows us, is that the Deutero Paul fleshes out the undertones of sexism in the genuine Paul. The genuine Paul is sexist most of the time. And he has these moments where it sounds like maybe he's rooting for us, but there is an undercurrent there that is negative, and that the Deutero is just the real, like the fleshing out of that, making it more prominent. That is what I think is going on. But I think it's really important that we ask, why do people give Paul the authority they give him? Why are people making this the hill they're dying on? Why is it so deeply important to agree with Paul or to find out what he meant, right? That to me is much more important, because I think we need to be able to see that is what's happening, so we can pull that apart. Because people making people establishing their careers on what Paul said is a thing. But I want to talk about that, and I would, for the sake of people's well-being, would like to invite people who do think these texts are important to reconsider that, to challenge the authority that Paul's texts have for them, to challenge the way they've been taught to read it. And even if it is positive, sure, that's great and all, but I am committed to the fact that there is, Paul himself, in the genuine Paul, is not as positive towards women as most people want to believe.
I must say I agree with you about, well, hold on. I don't know about most people. I think most people are not egalitarian Paulists. I will say that egalitarian Paulists are a subset of scholars. And there are some congregants and progressive Christians that are followers of the egalitarian Paulist position. But I would say that the majority of position is absolutely one, like the traditionalist position is that there is no pseudo-Paul.
Yeah,
and from the perspective of the egalitarians, like the fact that I don't believe 1 Timothy is canonical puts me on the outside of all this. Like the fact that I believe that there are canonical forgeries means that people who believe that the entire thing is the revealed and like handed down from God as this like mandate, they can't listen to me at all. So I'm not trying to act like my position is the dominant position or anything like that. And by the way, the quotation refutation hypothesis that you knew from your time at Vanderbilt, which was also where or since that
where I encountered it, and
wherever you encountered it. Odo Scott went there too. He was a product.
I'm just saying that people at Vanderbilt didn't know of his work, and I encountered it at Baylor. But
that's great. But what I'm saying is that we are familiar with his work, but most people aren't. The QR position has been a very obscure and not well known compared to the interpolation hypothesis. Wire doesn't even address it, right? In her book, she doesn't even mention the QR position as a possibility because she's evidently unaware of it because it's first starting to be published in the late 80s when she's editing her book. So her book was in production at the time that these arguments were first being formulated before they were even published. I mean, not the late 80s, sorry. They were published maybe, no, it would have been early. The earliest examples would have been from the mid to early 80s, but the refinement of the argument comes later. So
that's not fair because she knows about the rhetorical move of quoting your opponent and responding to it. She talks about that.
Yes,
that's not fair to say
but
that.
she doesn't. But she does. She's unaware of the scholarship on this passage. On that,
it doesn't matter because she's saying the same thing.
Okay, well, we'll have to agree to disagree, but let me say that I agree with you that the deuterals are fleshing out the actual undercurrents because Paul is not a pure egalitarian. Nobody is. Paul is absolutely a product of his time. He is somebody, I believe, who represents a more egalitarian wing of early Christianity, but that doesn't mean that he's personally an enlightened individual who doesn't have sexist tendencies that can be observed in his genuine writing. I am absolutely comfortable and open to that possibility. I think that is a very reasonable thing to say, and the holistic rhetorical argument about his sexism is something that I do need to become more familiar with. So I want to go back and I want to understand this better with respect to what you're saying here. Going back to what was your question? The question that we're responding to, the closing question, is what's Paul's purpose? The problem with Paul is he doesn't have one purpose. One of the things that all the genuine epistles have in common is they're highly contextual. The genuine epistles are all written for different audiences at different times with different reasons. And Paul is quirky. Paul is very inconsistent. Paul changes his mind a lot. So I agree with that. The possibility of Paul not having the same position on women at different times in his career, that's absolutely defensible. If you read letters side by side, he is chameleonic because he wants to impress his audience. His rhetoric is directed at his audience. So he doesn't represent himself the same way when he's writing to the Romans versus the Galatians, right? He comes off as much more friendly to Jewish Christianity in the Epistle of the Romans than he does in any of his other works. It's because he's writing to a congregation in Rome that has a lot more Jews, right? And so he knows that if he comes off as hostile towards the kosher observant wing of the Jesus movement, he's going to get a worse response in the letter to Romans, right? And so he is absolutely comfortable representing himself differently in different ways to different audiences. And this is one of the problems. And I think this is absolutely his Achilles heel in the letter to the Corinthians, which I think has been, no matter how sexist you think Paul really was, he is more sexist as a result of the way his work is read. And his work is read because of the way he wrote it. So it's on him. I am not absolving him. And I absolutely agree with you that his outsized role as a figure in early Christianity is undeserved. It's because of the earliness of his writing. It's because his letters are the earliest that survive. And because of that, it's why both traditionalists, because of his influence on the whole canon, right? His ideas percolate through and create, have streams that are visible in all the other texts of the New Testament. That's one reason. And critical scholars like me and other people like earlier authors, right? We're interested in the source stuff. So therefore we go back to we think earlier texts are more informative. And so that's our own bias. So there's lots of problems here. And unfortunately, we don't have a time machine, but darn it, I wish we did. And Dr. Bird, thank you. I sense your frustration with me. I'm sorry. I really was hoping this would be a little less stressful, but I'm not, I'm not, and I agree with you that I have a lot to learn from Wire. A lot.
You also just imply that critical scholars are text critics.
Oh, well, yeah, hold on. You're right.
That's, I mean,
right. I conflate those concepts sometimes in my, off the cuff. And
you just said it.
Yeah, no, I'm saying I
said that as critical scholars, we're text critics. Like, well, maybe, but that's not all that I do as a critical scholar, and that's not where I put my bread and butter. That's not my bread and butter.
Okay, and I lumped you in with me. I would say that I'm an archaeologist first and foremost. So yes, and a lot of like debates about the historical Jesus and all these, like there's so many different, it depends on what you're doing with the ancient texts. There's so many different reasons we can study them. But for people who are interested in getting at what was Christianity like in the first century, there are, the fact is that a lot of the canon comes after Paul, and Paul's influence is there in the versions we have. Unfortunately, there were probably written documents that were contemporaneous to Paul or earlier than Paul, or texts behind the Gospels that we don't have. So unfortunately, I'm just, my instinct is the reason why Paul has so much a burden placed upon him to explain the movement and why his words matter so much is because of his temporal priority in the text stream. Sorry.
I mean, you could argue that because he created this movement, so of course his
right. If he's the first Christian, but he never called himself a Christian.
Sorry, he's not the first Christian.
Yeah, he didn't call himself.
I'd love it if we could stick to the topic instead of pulling in all these other things that we're going to disagree on or see subtly differently than perhaps you realize. It feels unfair to me that you've thrown so many different topics out there in your concluding comments, and I'm like, wow, that was So anyway.
Jacob asked about why. What was your question again, Oscar? I was trying to answer Jacob's question.
Yeah, the question I asked you, Joe, is it was about 1 Corinthians and what you
think
think
doing here.
Correct.
Yeah. So I lost that. I lost
how to understand.
I was thinking about Paul in general. Yeah. So what is he doing in 1 Corinthians? That's okay. Then Jennifer, that explains why I left I got off track because
I thought, and for a moment I thought you were trying to make examples as to why similar things that you think is going on in other scenarios to support your position on 1 Corinthians.
Okay, but so I
they're
think
all
that
connected. It's just that there's so many claims being made that it's up for debate, and so that it just made me very uncomfortable.
Why don't I just take the super chat questions real quick, and then we can close.
That'd be great.
And I'm sorry I bobbled the last question.
Ronan at Stag, thank you for your super sticker.
Thanks, Ronan.
LDM, thank you for your super chat. Dr. Bird, thank you. Okay, S. Mill has a question. Thank you for your super chat. What are we defining as the bar for now not sexist, just for comparison? The Gospel of Mark or the Gospel of Mary? I don't know if y'all want to answer that. What do y'all want to do with that?
I don't spend a lot of time in the Gospels, partly because there's plenty to do with what I do. And what I mean is like Gospel of Mary, Gospel, these kinds of things I don't spend a lot of time with, just to be honest. So if we were going to say now not sexist, the Gospel of Mark, I actually don't really have a very informed way of engaging that. What about you, Joe? You probably have some thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good. I think that you can definitely see some Gnostic traditions as being much less sexist, but then there's problematic stuff like in the Gospel of Thomas where Jesus says that women can be apostles too, but they have to become men, right? That's the notorious line in the Gospel according to Thomas, which is one of the non-canonical Gospels, like Mary. So yes, you can, but I'll agree with Dr. Bird that sexism is not so easy to define. I think that you're absolutely right that people are not sexist holistically, but sexism is gauged on a case-by-case basis based on the individual claims and statements in a text. So you can say how does gender interact with the themes of the thing, and where are women placed in this hierarchy with men? That varies a little bit. So you could say that the Gospels show women being smart and men being stupid a lot. The canonical Gospels often show women making smart moves and getting Jesus, just like children get Jesus. This is part of the thing. The people who society regards as inferior intellectually are the ones who actually understand the Jesus guy. So, the conventional view is definitely that the Pauline corpus is more sexist than the Gospels, right? And I would argue that that's a lot to do with the Pauline forgers' role, but that's neither here nor there.
I want to know how much longer you're going to spend.
5 more minutes.
Ronan of Stag, thank you for your super chat. Thank you. Is it possible Thecla betrayed him? Do y'all have a response to that?
I have too much to say, so it's hard to make it short.
I think my families are asking me to return to their presence soon. How many more super chats?
Yeah,
you
can see him, Joe, in the start. I'm just going to say that I think that the story of Thecla is working with an element of the genuine Paul. So I think that's really interesting. I also tend to read the story of Thecla as explaining part of what's going on behind 1 Timothy and the content there. And it's the way to make sense of 1 Timothy 2, 11, 15 is with that. So I don't know if Thecla betrayed him. I think it's Thecla. The story of Thecla works with genuine Paul content and plays with it and teases it out. And so I think it's really fun that you asked a question, Ronan Stag, and I'm not sure that she's betraying him. I think it's just a really interesting piece of early Christian debates and arguing going on.
So I agree with you. My take is that it definitely interacts with the pastoral forgeries, that the author of the Acts of Paul knew both Timothy's, 1st and 2nd, and had a positive view of 2 Timothy and a negative view of 1 Timothy, because generally speaking, like 1 Timothy is anti-abstinence, pro-alcohol use, pro-child women get saved through childbearing, which are very un-Pauline. Absolutely, I diametrically opposed to 1 Corinthians 7. There's no way that the same person who wrote 1 Corinthians 7 wrote 1 Timothy and 1 Timothy, that is. And the author of the Acts of Paul seems to be very sympathetic with second Timothy's perspectives, but constantly undermines the positions of 1 Timothy. And yes, they refer to the same names, the same people. So there's deep engagement between those 3 texts, in my opinion.
We just have one more super chat left and then a super sticker. S. Mill, thank you for your super chat. I feel like Wilson's line of theology edges on you can dismiss verses you don't like because you don't know the context of the culture and audience. Joe, do you have a response?
No, I don't. I guess I have to respond, but I'll say that I'm arguing for the understanding of context, and the way that we do that is through the constellation of texts surrounding a text. So the way texts are read and used is how they are cited by contemporaries or the nearest authors to respond to them, show that their impact on their cultural environment of their production. So, and material evidence, like for example, when when we find evidence for prominent women clergy in Orthodox and Catholic churches in the first 3-4 centuries, when we find, mosaics depicting women doing Eucharistic activities, clearly leading congregations that, and buried in prominent grave sites, we say early Christianity was not sexist the way later Christianity was. How do we reconcile that with the texts? And so the texts and the actual people as they were living in that tradition, I see the egalitarian reading of Paul as a solution to the problem of how can Paul be associated with all these women leaders and yet be telling them they're not allowed to talk at the same time.
Well, Ronan F. Stagg, thank you for your super sticker.
Thank you.
And Adam S. managed to sneak in a super chat right there. So I figured this could be answered very quickly. So thank you for your super chat, Adam. Did Paul have children? He calls Titus his son because I'm going to be holding Paul for what he said.
Yeah, I think that when Paul speaks this way, he's speaking more familiarly, not literally. I think it'd be hilarious if Paul had children, given his comments about sex. And
he is anti-procreation. He does not want anyone to have children.
It doesn't mean that he didn't actually have sex with a woman and get her pregnant at some point, but it's kind of,
No, I agree.
It's metaphorical in my opinion.
No. And that's one of the main reasons why we know 1 Timothy is a forgery, because he says women can only be saved through childbirth. And the author of 1 Timothy is not Paul.
They can only be saved through childbirth. But anyway, it's a political issue that he's addressing. That they're addressing there anyway.
Well,
thank you for having us, Jacob.
Yeah.
I appreciate you hosting this conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jennifer, and I must again apologize for being frustratingly obtuse, and I wasn't intending to.
I took your intentions to be really positive for this conversation.
I'm sorry if it worked out that they didn't seem that way in reality, but I'm very thankful that you came back and followed up. I know you're doing this because I asked you to, and I'm grateful that it mattered to you enough to take me up on my invitation. And thank you, Jacob, for hosting us. And I got to go help fix dinner. So,
yeah, thank you both for joining me. I'm just going to start playing the outro now.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.